right, so today we're really going to dig in. We're taking a deep dive into the history of the Christian right.
With God's own party, right?
Exactly, God's own party. And, you know, it's just wild to me. How did this group go from, like, feeling like total outsiders to having this massive influence on politics? I mean, where do we even begin with a story like that?
Well, I mean, the book starts us off in the 1920s.
Okay.
And it might surprise you to hear that, like, the Christian right's political journey, it didn't start with, like, small government or, you know, the Republican Party as we know it today. Yeah. Their early attempts to gain political power, they were laser focused on things like prohibition.
Oh, wow.
Keeping evolution out of schools. And get this, they were really worried about this shift from rural to urban life.
So wait, they wanted more government back then, at least like when it was convenient for their beliefs?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the opposite of what they're known for now, right? Like their whole thing was stuff like the New Deal.
It's true. And it just shows you how much their political identity was still forming, right?
Yeah.
They saw cities, right? And they're thinking those are dens of iniquity. Like it's a completely different world.
Wow.
It reminds me of that story in the book about Bob Jones Sr. I don't know if you know, he was a big-time fundamentalist.
Okay.
And he gives this whole speech, right? And the title is Santa Claus MD. Can you believe that?
Santa Claus MD.
It was this whole critique of government programs, but like disguised as a Christmas message.
Yeah.
Wild, right?
It's kind of funny, but also kind of scary.
Right.
Yeah. But it doesn't sound like at that point they were exactly winning over like the average American. Did things change for them when the Cold War started heating up?
Oh, absolutely. The Cold War was a game changer. It gave these conservative Protestants a way to kind of like get back on the same page as the government because suddenly their whole anti-communist message, everyone's listening now, right?
Yeah,
it's resonating. Yeah. America, in their view, became this like beacon of faith standing strong against, quote, godless communism.
Yeah, and that's where, I mean, we can't talk about this without talking about Billy Graham.
Oh, absolutely.
He was huge.
He's a pivotal figure in all of this.
Yeah.
He really understood how to tap into the worries of that time. And he was charismatic, you know, he had this way of speaking. He presented America as like this chosen nation, but we're in this spiritual battle. And his relationship with Eisenhower, I mean, fascinating stuff.
Oh, they were close.
Close. And Graham even influenced how Eisenhower presented himself to the public, you know, as this devout leader. Graham just got it. He knew how to combine faith and patriotism, and he did it on a massive scale.
So things are looking up for these conservative Christians.
Good.
Right? They're more politically connected than they've been. Did it last?
Well, that's where the story takes this really interesting turn.
Okay.
Because as the civil rights movement starts picking up steam, late 50s, early 60s,
Right.
big rifts start appearing. And the biggest one, racial integration.
And this is where figures like Bob Jones Jr. come back into the picture.
Exactly. Now, Billy Graham, he kind of took a middle-of-the-road stance, you know, supported gradual integration.
Smart move, probably, with such a wide audience.
For sure, strategic. But people like Bob Jones Jr., they went all in on segregation.
Wow.
I mean, he even called the civil rights movement a communist plot. Can you imagine?
So you've got the pragmatists versus, like,
yeah.
the hardcore believers.
Exactly. And it gets more intense.
Okay.
Because this is when you get guys like Billy James Hargis, Carl McIntyre, you might not have heard of them, but they were incredibly influential. They figured out how to use radio to their advantage.
Oh, interesting.
Right. Broadcasting their message all over the South, anti-communism, right-wing ideology, the works.
It's like they knew how to use the media to, like, amplify their message. Feels familiar, right?
Oh, yeah. This is a sign of things to come.
What about John F. Kennedy? What did they think of him as president? Being Catholic and all, that had to ruffle some feathers.
Huge point of contention. They were completely against him, and it was all because he was Catholic.
Wow.
They were afraid of, like, the Pope controlling America. Seriously.
No way.
It just drove that wedge even deeper between, you know, the evangelicals who were open to some change and the hardcore fundamentalists who were not budging.
So it sounds like the Christian right's journey to getting political power has been anything but a straight line. It's been influential at times, yeah, but there's also been setbacks, infighting. What happened as America moved into the 60s? Things were changing so much back then.
Well, the 60s brought a wave of social change, unlike anything before it.
Yeah.
The sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, and of course, Roe v. Wade. Conservative Christians, they felt like they were under attack, like their values were being erased. They started to see themselves as this silent majority.
That's a powerful phrase, isn't it? The silent majority. Like they're this whole group that feels ignored, like they're being silenced by all this change happening around them. So how do they start making themselves heard?
It really started from the ground up, with everyday people getting involved.
Okay.
Take the anti-ERA movement, for example. Conservative women, like Phyllis Schlafly, they were really leading the charge.
Yeah.
They tapped into this fear that traditional gender roles were under attack.
It was a really uncertain time for a lot of people.
For sure. And at the same time, you have this other movement gaining traction, the anti-abortion movement.
Right. And that one's interesting because it wasn't just evangelicals at the forefront, right?
But you're right. It actually began mostly as a Catholic movement. But then you have figures like Francis Schaeffer. He was a big deal.
Oh, hugely influential. His books, his lectures, he really knew how to connect with evangelicals.
Absolutely. And that's when you start to see evangelicals really joining the anti-abortion movement in large numbers.
And wasn't that also around the time that secular humanism became like this big boogeyman for them?
Oh, yeah. Secular humanism became the ultimate enemy.
Right.
It represented everything they saw as a threat to their faith, from education to like what was on TV, you name it.
Everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And having that common enemy, it really brought them together. They felt like they weren't just reacting anymore. They needed to act, take charge. The silent majority was done being silent.
And that's where televangelism really explodes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You can't talk about this era without talking about guys like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell.
They were rock stars. Televangelism gave them this, like, direct line to millions of homes, a national stage.
It was huge, bigger than just preaching, really.
Oh, for sure. It was about building a movement, getting organized, influencing people's views.
Right.
They created this whole alternative media world going head-to-head with the mainstream.
So they've got the organization, the media power. They're aligning themselves more and more with the Republicans. Were they all in on Reagan at this point?
It's actually more complicated than that. I mean, yeah, support for the GOP was growing, but there were these really sharp strategists, guys like Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie.
Okay.
They saw how powerful evangelical voters could be for the Republicans. So they focused on targeted messages, direct mail, raising money. They basically built the Christian rights political machine.
Wow. So they're organized. They've got the infrastructure. It's the perfect storm. Then Reagan comes along. What was it about him? Why did they connect with him so strongly?
Reagan was a master at understanding their worries, their hopes, their dreams.
Yeah.
He spoke their language. Literally, I mean, he used phrases like family values, moral majority.
Big words.
Exactly. They resonated. And beyond just the policies, he presented this image of America that they really connected with. A nation grounded in faith, patriotism, tradition, things they felt were slipping away.
Yeah. After years of feeling like ignored, like their voices didn't matter, he gave them hope. But did his presidency actually achieve everything they hoped for?
That's the thing about actually being in power. It's messy. You have to compromise.
It's not always black and white.
Exactly. And while Reagan was sympathetic, he was also a politician. The Christian right, they had to learn how to work the system.
So they had a seat at the table, but maybe they didn't love the food. Did that lead to some disillusionment?
There was definitely frustration.
Yeah.
Especially with issues like abortion, school prayer. They weren't seeing the progress they wanted.
Right.
But they were also getting smarter, more strategic. They realized that real change, lasting change, meant thinking long term. And that's when they set their sights on the courts.
The Supreme Court, judicial appointments,
Yeah.
playing the long game. And did it work?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, they got some big wins with conservative judges on the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
but they also hit roadblocks. Even a court that's sympathetic to your views, it still has to operate within the law. And this is also when we see groups like the moral majority rise and fall.
Oh, right. They were huge for a while.
Huge. They were incredibly effective at getting people to vote, especially in the South. But their laser focus on abortion, as potent as it was,
It also kind of backfired.
it alienated some people within the movement, yeah.
It's interesting how a tactic that was so successful for a time can end up dividing people later on.
It just goes to show you the Christian right, it wasn't this like one-size-fits-all group. You had different factions, different leaders, all with their own ideas about how to get what they wanted.
They're only human, right? And the world was changing around them too. The Cold War ended, new social movements popped up. It wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Absolutely. And the world was becoming a lot less receptive to their message. Even the Republican Party, while they were mostly on the same page, they were also becoming more divided.
More fractured.
Right. And then George W. Bush. An evangelical president.
They must have been thrilled.
You would think so.
But did his presidency bring everyone together?
So we left off with George W. Bush entering the White House. High hopes all around, I imagine. Did he live up to the hype for the Christian right?
It's complicated. On the surface, he seemed like their guy. Talked about his faith, emphasized family, supported policies they liked, like that ban on late-term abortions.
Sure.
But his presidency really showed the cracks in the movement, too.
Because even with his beliefs, he couldn't get everything they wanted through Congress.
Exactly. Like that amendment to ban same-sex marriage totally stalled. And that's when you start to see some, especially younger evangelicals, feeling like the Republicans were taking them for granted.
Interesting. Voting for other stuff that mattered more to the party, not their key issues.
Right. And that's where that feeling of being let down really takes hold. Then you get the Tea Party, figures like Trump. The book doesn't cover that, but man, does it feel relevant.
That's well connected, right? Totally. I mean, think about it by their own standards. Trump was not their ideal candidate.
To put it mildly.
Right. Divorced, not exactly known for, holy living.
A little rough around the edges.
To say the least. But he captured a huge chunk of that evangelical vote.
Because he knew how to tap into that same anger, that fear of losing their country that the Christian right was built on.
Exactly. Conservative judges overturning Roe, make America great again. That really resonated with their desire for a simpler, more moral time.
But at what cost, right? I mean, look at what happened.
Exactly. Polarization, this feeling that it's all about winning no matter what, and those values they'd been fighting for kind of got lost in the shuffle.
It makes you think about the compromises people make for power and whether it's worth it in the end.
And for the Christian right, it revealed this big tension. How do you hold on to your faith when you're so deep in politics? By hitching their wagon to one party, did they lose some of their moral authority? It's a question that still divides them today.
So where do they go from here? What's the future of God's own party now when America itself is changing so fast?
It's a tough one. They've been incredibly influential, that's undeniable. But the path forward, it's murky. The old guard is moving on, younger generations, they're not as tied to the Republicans. Climate change, social justice, those are their issues.
It's almost like a reminder that these political movements, they're not set in stone. They shift, they break apart, they adapt. And the Christian right, their story is not this straight line. It's messy, complicated, full of contradictions, just like faith, just like power, just like trying to find your voice when the world's changing all around you.
And what's so great about this book, it doesn't just lay out the history, it makes you think. About what's shaping our politics, the choices we make, everything.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and names. It's about figuring out what it all means, what we've learned, how it connects to what we're dealing with right now. So if this got you thinking, definitely check out God's Own Party. You'll probably be surprised by what you discover about this movement, its impact. And hey, maybe it'll inspire you to do some digging of your own. Thanks for listening.